Good afternoon or evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this POZ at Home series, which is sponsored by, co-sponsored by the Sero Project and by the World AIDS Museum. I want to thank Jennifer and Ian and Christian and Oriel at POZ for organizing this and putting together, helping us all with the technology, making it go smoothly, and as well as Dr. Raquel Lopez and Andrew Ruffner, who's the Director of Educational Programming at the World AIDS Museum in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I will introduce our guests and myself in just a moment. I do want to say that you're welcome to post questions in the chat box or on the Facebook page, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we're able to. Also, want you to be aware that we are recording the program, and then we'll have a link available in a day or two for people who weren't able to join us today, although we have many joining us today, which is terrific. I'm Sean Strub. I'm the founder of POZ Magazine, the executive director of the Sero Project, which is a US-based national network of people living with HIV, particularly focused on combating HIV criminalization. We've also been doing a fair amount of work looking at the early years of the epidemic and documenting histories that maybe have not been fully recorded. And as part of that process and just my own personal interest in friendship over the years, I've been speaking with Dr. Joseph Sonnabend, who is a physician, now retired, who lives in London and is one of our guests today. Dr. Sonnabend was also my doctor. And while I am fortunate to be in pretty good health today, there was a time 25 years ago or so when I weighed 40 pounds less than I weigh now. I was covered in Kaposi's sarcoma, including in my lungs, pulmonary chaos. My viral load was in the millions, and at one point, my CD4 count was down to 1. And we'll come back to T cells in just a moment. And I credit a lot of the reason for my survival to exceptional doctoring from Joe Sonnabend. Joe Sonnabend was had a background as a researcher and a virologist, but also had a practice in New York that included a lot of gay men in the medical practice in the early 80s, and saw the first patients coming down with this mysterious disease. And he had a huge list of accomplishments, and I've long felt that he was one of the least heralded and most important figures in the epidemic. So it's always a pleasure to remind people of all the things that Joe was involved in. Joe was involved in writing the first legislation that was HIV specific around confidentiality issues in New York State. He was the subject of the first AIDS-related civil rights litigation when his landlord tried to kick him out for having a practice that was treating people with AIDS. He created in 1981 a network of researchers that then became the nucleus of what turned into what we know today as the American Foundation for AIDS Research, AMFAR. He discovered interferon in the circulation of people with AIDS. He had a background working with Alec Isaacs, the discoverer of interferon. Joe was one of the first physicians to promote prophylaxis for PCP, the pneumonia that was the #1 killer of people with AIDS in their early years. He discovered that an inexpensive sulfa drug that was widely available was very effective at preventing it. He, with 2 of his patients, Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz, wrote How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, One Approach, which was the landmark booklet proposing condoms and measures to interrupt the transmission of whatever this pathogen was that was making people ill. He also was the founder of the Community-Based Research Initiative and was one of the architects of the Community-Based Clinical Trial Network that collected data from clinicians who were actually treating people. He also was involved with the founding of the PWA Buyers Club in New York with Tom Hannon and Michael Callan. Joe founded the first professional journal dedicated to the epidemic called AIDS, which today is called AIDS Research in Human Retroviruses. And all of that, as well as caring for a very large number of people with AIDS or at risk of AIDS. And even more remarkable, he did all of that without any significant governmental or institutional support. Over the years, as I've interviewed Joe many times, he has spoken about people early in the epidemic who he thought played very important roles. And not long ago we were talking, and he again mentioned Dr. Stuart Schlossman, and saying that, you know, incredibly important early in the epidemic. He didn't see him recognized in any of the histories and was concerned that his role and contribution could get lost. And that's part of what prompted the idea for the series of conversations, which this is the first one. Dr. Schlossman, as I think Joe described him to me as in 1981, was the world's expert on T cells. And he and his colleagues, Dr. Schlossman and colleagues, were responsible for the discovery of the cell surface proteins, which can identify populations of lymphoid cells that have distinct functions and that are typically altered in people with immune dysfunction. And so that became, you know, the early marker of people who had an impaired immune system, but maybe weren't showing other clinical manifestations of the disease at that point. And this was all fairly new. This was work that he did in the 1970s. And I want to just read something that Joe wrote me that I'm going to quote without his permission, but I hope that'll be okay. He said, Dr. Schlossman occupies an important place in the history of the epidemic that is in danger of being completely forgotten, which I suppose is possible because it was really never very widely known. The ability to efficiently recognize T cell subsets was first worked out in the late 70s. And Dr. Schlossman was head of a research group at Harvard that developed the reagents that allowed detection of T cell subsets such as CD4 and CD8. So for those of us living with HIV and have been very tethered to our CD4 counts for years and years and years, we can thank Dr. Schlossman for having that important marker. But in 1981, there wasn't much known about these T cell subsets, how they vary with age or gender or in different diseases. And the machines and the technology to detect it was to differentiate them was fairly new. So Joe reached out to Dr. Schlossman sometime in 1981. As many on this call I'm sure know, that the first reports in the mainstream media of the epidemic was in July in the New York Times. So sometime in the next few months, Dr. Sonnabend reached out to Dr. Schlossman. And as Joe said, he began the conversation by saying he assumed that Dr. Schlossman had been swamped with calls for advice about T cells by that point. And that Dr. Schlossman said, as Joe recalls, that Joe was the first person to call him, and he was very interested in helping. So with that, I'd like Dr. Schlossman and Dr. Sonnabend to turn on their cameras. It looks like they have. And welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.
Dr. Schlossman, I think, is in Boston, and Dr. Sonnabend is in London. So I want to start. This is going to be fairly free form, and you're welcome to speak directly to each other. We want to get into a conversation. But why don't each of you just start with telling us about when you first heard that something was going on with gay men and the immune systems of gay men. Joe, why don't you go ahead, and then
Why don't you start, Joe? Yeah.
Okay, all right. So I was aware, at least for about 3 years before 1981, that there was something wrong. But in the sense that my patients, the people I was seeing, had things like low white blood counts, modest anemia, large lymph glands, big spleens, a whole host of things that couldn't really be explained by the frequent sexually transmitted infection. I didn't know what, of course I didn't, and nobody knew quite what this was. So how did I first get to know about what was going on? I had a patient who was anemic, and I had referred him to Dr. Wallace, Joyce Wallace, for further workup of the anemia. In the course of the workup, he had a tube, a tube was put into his stomach to inspect his stomach. And there the gastroenterologist noticed purple lesions in the stomach, which of course he was totally unfamiliar with. A biopsy was taken, and the diagnosis was Kaposi sarcoma. So Joyce Wallace then called me and told me she'd never heard of Kaposi sarcoma, so she said she called the National Cancer Institute to ask for a referral to somebody in New York who understood and knew something about Kaposi sarcoma. And so this is the first I got to know. Joyce told me that she was told that Alvin Friedman Keene, a dermatologist at NYU, had a number of patients who were gay, maybe I've forgotten the number, but maybe more than 10, who had Kaposi sarcoma. And this was completely unbelievable to me, this news. And I, of course, knew Alvin. I knew Alvin because he had a place in the lab of Jan Wilczek. Jan Wilczek was the head of the virology lab at NYU. And he and I were sort of contemporaries in interferon research. We go back to the 1960s. And so we were colleagues. He in Czechoslovakia at the time. And then he moved to the United States in the late 60s. And so that's when I sort of first came here as well. So I knew Jan from the early days. We were kind of contemporaries and fellow kind of researchers. There weren't many. The interferon world was pretty small. So Jan had come to New York. He established the lab at NYU, and Alvin had a place there. And so, of course, I immediately called Jan Wilczek, and he said, yes, it's absolutely true. It was, to me, completely unbelievable. I mean, just completely, absolutely unbelievable. And so I went to work in the lab. I split my time between the mornings in the lab, and I saw patients in the afternoon. So that's how, the question was, how did I first become aware that there was something going on in gay men? And so the answer then is, I was sort of aware of it because my patients in New York, many had a history of multiple sexually transmitted infections, but they had chronic abnormalities that were unexplained. Low blood platelets, low white, just on routine blood work. And so there was something for about 3 years before AIDS that was kind of not explained. And I'm sure other doctors caring for gay men in New York, maybe San Francisco and other places, also noted these things. And then I first knew about Kaposi sarcoma when Joyce Wallace told me what she had heard. And that's how I first knew about it.
Great. Dr. Schlossman?
Well, I turned my attention to the human immune response in the early 70s. I had been working in the guinea pig for years before that, went on sabbatical in London, and decided at that time that I would change some direction in my research. And although I was trained as a hematologist, a blood doctor, and I actually signed out bone marrows at one of the Harvard hospitals for 7 years, you would just look at them under the microscope with different stains. But there was always an argument, what was a myeloid cell, what there were different types of lymphoid cells, etc. And it was not a great thought, but it was rational to begin to make antibodies against human cells and being able to type human cells as they did red cells for so many years. And so in 1973, I moved to the Dana-Farber and developed a large enough laboratory that we could begin to study the human immune response, made antibodies to human T cells. We were able to distinguish T cells from B lymphocytes, from other myeloid cells, and then we began making antibodies that can distinguish subsets of T cells. And the subsets had different functions. And so one turned out to be the CD4 population, and the other the CD8 population. And the CD4 was a primary helper cell that would help activate the immune response, help B cells make antibody, whereas the CD8 population was a regulatory cell, it was a suppressor cell, it was a cytotoxic cell that killed targets. But this was the beginning of human immunology. So we needed to understand it better. And one of the ways of understanding it, we're looking at people with diseases that we knew to be immunologic. And that was children with severe combined immunodeficiency, adults with all sorts of diseases, autoimmune diseases. And then while we're looking at this, Joe calls up and says that he has this group of patients that he thinks have a problem with their immune response, and would I help? And we had the reagents and the resources to look at the T lymphocytes of patients, gay patients with immunodeficiency. And it was an extraordinary event at that time. I called up my research nurse who used to go to New York to pick up some of the blood and bleed some of Joe's patients in his office. And she said that we may have started in the fall of 1981 when she would go down, and we collected a fairly large number of patients who were healthy, monogamous, healthy, more promiscuous individuals who had Kaposi's and immunodeficiency, and we began to look at their T cell subsets. And it was very clear at that time that the CD4 population was markedly lowered. The CD8 population was really not affected, and this was the major, it helped prove that this was the major helper cell in the human body and how critical it was for the immune response. But it also told us that there were underlying, this wasn't an accident. It was caused by some sort of agent that actually affected these T lymphocytes. And that marker was able to, put people's attention on the T cell, what infects the T cell, and why this would come about. And so it was an extraordinary, enlightening time, and it was a time that we thought that this information would help deal with this gay-related immunodeficiency disease and get lots of people on board to study it.
And did the two of you know each other before?
Well, we've been trying to figure that out. We overlapped at Mill Hill in London. I was at that time an associate professor at Harvard on a sabbatical year, and I went to London. Joe was working at Mill Hill. We had a common friend who was a classmate of mine at medical school who also worked on interferon and was a collaborator of Joe's. So we may have met, may not have, but we certainly knew the same group of people who were interested in virology, and he was aware of my interest in immunology. And Mill Hill was an extraordinary institute for immunology at that time. They had wonderful scientists there, as they did wonderful people working in interferon research and virology.
And when Joe contacted you, had you already heard of what was then being called GRID, or was he
No.
tell you about?
I had nobody. I stopped seeing patients in 1973 because the lab got big. I was traveling all of the time. And so nobody would send me a patient, or very rarely would anyone tell me. I was mainly involved in the hematologic malignancies. And Joe was the first one to really say that he had patients with who had Kaposi sarcoma, who had infections, pneumocystis, and all of the, and the difficulties that would suggest that this may well be an immunologic problem. But Joe called my attention to the problem, and we were able to work together for some time after that.
And when did you get some sense of the enormity of what this meant? Was that immediately apparent, or was it just sort of a curiosity and then it grew over time?
You know, the arrogance, one would really say, well, it proved I was right, you know, that CD4 was a key lymphocyte population, because not everybody in the immunologic community was that interested in subsets of T lymphocytes. They were interested in antibody, and they actually thought antibody was made in the refrigerator because that's where they found it on Monday morning. But so the cellular basis of that was not high on their list. So arrogantly, but then the enormity of the problem struck you, not only in the gay community, but in the blood community, because the transmission, a possible transmission in blood banks. hemophilia, patients who had intravenous narcotic use. So it became an explosively large problem that really had to be dealt with from the scientific and the clinical communities.
I should say one thing about my calling you. Well, as we know now, the disease came to attention in the New York Times. It was July 1981. There were a few papers that described it. I think they were in the New England Journal, just very few clinical cases. And yeah, it was recognized that there were T subset abnormalities, but in all the papers, and there were very few, and the information that was coming out, none of the researchers could be considered to be experts in this new field of immunology. Well, it wasn't new, but I mean, the technology was certainly new. And so at that time in 1981, there really were very few people who could claim to be truly experts in the biology of T cell subsets and the technology involved in their detection. And so we're faced with this disease, which was involving T cell subsets, yet the people publishing about it, nobody had solicited the help of experts. There were very few experts at that time because it was the ability to detect T cell subsets with monoclonal antibodies was pretty fresh. And so, but Stuart was one of those people. And it's kind of remarkable that it was sort of left to me, just a little community doctor, to make that contact. I would have kind of thought, as I assumed, that people interested in solving this disease would have clamored for the collaboration with the person who was instrumental in developing the technology, but no. So that's one thing just to notice, that in the first year of the epidemic, it was possible to buy machines that could analyze T cell subsets. So you had then physicians, I know there were actually physicians, who purchased or rented machines with a technician. And so their patients would come and they'd do their T cells for them, I suppose for a fee, whatever. But they had no training at all in this field. And so that struck me as being very odd, that the literature was coming from clinicians mostly, who had some immunological experience maybe, but certainly nobody, I thought when in the first few months, I thought, well, this is clearly a disease that apparently is involving T cell subsets, and who knows most about this? And I was just kind of surprised that a year had passed and nobody had solicited the help of the experts, in this. And that just simply remains with me as something, it tells us, I think, something about the competitiveness of those times, that you had doctors who could rent a cell sorter and a technician to run it. They didn't have to know anything about it. And maybe, could see, who knows, career advancement, God knows what. But we weren't all, anyway, that's, I suppose, what I'm trying to say is that I called Stuart because I identified him as quite clearly as the one person who knew most about T cell subsets, and I just find it remarkable that it had to wait for me to do that, and that he hadn't been contacted a year earlier. That's just a comment on this thing.
So, Joe,
one of the things I realized was that when Joe contacted me and we started looking at gay men, the T cell subsets in them, we could have published in 1981, but there was an insistence on our part to make sure that we understood what we were seeing. And so we published on a very large number of gay men, healthy, monogamous, more promiscuous with evidence of disease, and others with serious disease. So we could really relate the entire, understand the problem. And that was a key paper at that time. And part of the reason that it wasn't published 4 months earlier was the need to see a large number of individuals to make sure that what we were finding was correct. And it was an interesting time.
This you're referring to the paper that was published in The Lancet in April of '82.
That's correct.
So that's also one I should mention that was rejected basically by gay community leaders. They didn't want to bring attention to it. And this was in the text, it was actually so well intentioned. It was meant to be kind of in an attempt to warn, to help people sort of avoid the circumstances that produce this immune deficiency. And yet it seemed to offend many people because it linked the acquisition of disease or this abnormality of immunological abnormality with a particular sexual pattern, that's to say, with people who had multiple partners, but also in certain geographic areas. It wasn't the multiple partners themselves. I presume that if people had multiple partners in Alaska, we wouldn't have been seeing this kind of stuff. And yet, for whatever reason, it seemed to provoke huge hostility. And that's something that's a current that's run through, I think, a lot, you know, in the history of research on AIDS. Is, I mean, behavior matters. What can one say, though? You know, germs, microbes may cause disease, but it's human behavior that spreads it. And so, and we're seeing obviously today with COVID, it's behavior matters, and I think people resist it. Now we see it with, you know, people unwilling to use face masks and God knows what, and maybe it was the same thing there, that you know, people were unwilling to heed warnings that might have led them to change their patterns of sexual expression. So maybe that's not just people don't want to be told what to do, even if it's for their benefit and to help them stay alive.
So I have the Lancet paper in front of me, and it basically makes the distinction between gay men who are monogamous, having much stronger immune function, and gay men are much more promiscuous, being impaired. But the sentence that was so unpopular is actually the very last sentence in the paper. And it says, on the basis of these data, it would seem prudent for homosexual men to consider possible effects upon their immunological responses of the frequency and diversity of their sexual partners. That was practically benign. It was so general, it was so absent of judgment. It was just sort of a, hey, look at this, you might consider this. But that, of course, became a very contentious message early in the epidemic.
Large number of patients.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
I say that was the advantage of looking at a very large number of individuals, gay individuals who had promiscuous, who were monogamous, who had good health, who were sick, and understanding what CD4 population and the loss of that population meant. Had we just reported on 1 or 2 patients and said, this individual has no CD4 cell and has AIDS, it would have less of an impact than the Lancet paper had, because it pointed out the behavior pattern and promiscuity and the relationship of multiple partners with the possibility of getting a more serious disease.
Yeah, well, sadly, people, I'm afraid, persisted in seeing this as a moral judgment when there was nothing of the sort, and there's nothing one can do about that. I mean, if one is driven by a wish to be helpful to people, and yet if one speaks about multiplicity of partners, it's seen by some people as a criticism of which it's not. It's just a health issue, that's all. As I said, if in fact multiple partners had been occurring, if our population we tested, I bet if the population we tested had been in Alaska or somewhere and had a lifestyle that involved multiple partners, I bet we wouldn't have seen much in the way of an abnormality there. So it's nothing to do with judgment. It's just, in fact, what it means is that there was a infectious agent circulating. So if you have a situation where there's frequent interchange, then whatever can be transmitted from one person to another, the prevalence is going to increase. So the probability of picking up something in areas where, like New York, as it were, would have been very great. And so that's all it was. It was just to do with infection. It has nothing to do with judgment. And that's something I've had to deal with throughout this epidemic, with people who saw my comments as being judgmental, despite the fact that I did, quite a lot to try and encourage safe sex, as quite a lot actually, and in a very sex positive way to encourage people, and tell them how important and well, not tell them what you know, but to emphasize how important sex is to the human experience. And yet, there were still people who persisted in seeing our warnings, if you like, as being judgmental. It had nothing to do with moral, absolutely zero.
So I want, in just a moment, I'm going to break for a second, and we've got a little message from the World AIDS Museum. But when we come back, I want to talk more about the politics. Joe, you were a community clinician in the middle of this with patients. You were encouraging to advocate for themselves, and became the target of attacks over the message that you were sharing. And there were two messages early on. One message was have fewer partners, and the other message was doesn't matter how many partners you have, it matters how much exposure you have to sexually transmitted diseases. And that was the safer sex message, is to stop the transmission of whatever this is. And so when we come back, I want to talk a little more about that. And Dr. Schlossman, I'd really like to hear how you viewed that, right? You're coming from a lab in a research environment, and it comes into these really intense politics. And I know you were kind of a witness to what Joe went through at that time. So I'd like to hear both your thoughts on that. But right now we're going to go.
Can I just throw in something now that we can come back to? It also has to do with Stuart, and we haven't at all addressed this. So my background, just quickly speak about this, because it really is a topic that also has been, it's important and has been varied in the way that, the kind of narrative that's taken hold is, the particular, that it's not referred to at all, but it's important. So my background in the lab has been in interferon research. So I think at that time I knew quite a lot about interferon. And one of the things that was that became apparent is that that interferon had some effect on T lymphocyte subsets. And so that again is a paper that Stuart was responsible for. It was in the Scandinavian Journal of Immunology. And so if you recall it, it was a paper from, I think, some Scandinavian people in your lab who did mixed lymphocyte cultures in the presence of interferon. And they noted that in the presence of interferon, CD4 subsets were preferentially suppressed by interferon. So we knew this. I think it was even before 1980.
Paul Anderson was postdoc in my laboratory, did his PhD with Jan Vilcek,
Right.
And he's now senior vice president at the Brigham and Women's Hospital.
All right, so here we have, so I knew this thing too.
So they've all done well with immunology and interferon. So.
Yeah, but I'm just saying this, it's not the time in this, Sean must stop this, but that we knew from the outset that there was evidence that interferon had a suppressive effect preferentially on CD4 cells. And I won't go into what happened after that, there was a move to treat people with interferon completely beyond words, beyond understanding. Who can understand that? Bizarre. And despite not only that evidence that there was a suppressive there, it was available to us in 1981, and yet seemed to be not understood or heeded or ignored by people who were promoting the use of interferon as a treatment. So I'm just saying that that's also something. And another reason, of course, why I have a particular interest is that when I was in the lab with Jan Vilcek, I had an idea that resulted in the discovery of large amounts of alpha interferon in the blood of people with AIDS. And that is also something just is a remarkable, I think remarkable, because it tells you one of the ways in which science progresses. And I'll just quickly tell you, in the lab, So we had, at NYU, there were patients with this new disease. So, you know, we looked at everything as anyone would do. And one of the things that you would do, as I think most people would do faced with patients with this new disease, we checked their HLA. It was possible that these patients with the disease have a particular kind of tissue specificity. In other words, so, you know, it was just a normal thing you would do. You're just trying to find out what's going on. So the person who was actually Pablo Rubinson at the Blood Center who was doing the HLA typing told us that he had difficulty doing it because it seemed the test, the reagents he was using depended on an antibody sticking to the surface of the lymphocyte. And he said he was having trouble because it appeared that the lymphocytes from the patients already were coated with immunoglobulins. And so that's in my mind. And then I was sitting in Jan Wilczek's office one day, and I saw a preprint of a paper of Jan Wilczek's where he reported that an antibody against lymphocytes, a CD3 antibody, was a
which I also discovered, which is also mine.
Yeah, well,
in fact, Nature called me to speak to me next week about a historical article on CD3.
So I saw this preprint. So Jan had used the CD3 and he found that it was a potent inducer of gamma interferon. And so that's what I saw this and I thought, oh, well, if in fact we were told by the guy who's doing the HLA typing that the patient's lymphocytes appear to be coated with immunoglobulins, and if a CD3 antibody induces gamma interferon, who knows, maybe the lymphocytes.
Well, CD3 is an antibody that can activate a T cell. It's CD3 is part of the T cell receptor. So it would trigger the T cell to make interferon.
That's right. But nobody knew this until Jan did this, and so I thought if that's the case, then maybe the antibodies that are being reported that coat the surface of lymphocytes interfering with HLA typing as well. So maybe they are, are inducing interferon as well. So we had the ability to do assays, and we did assays for interferon, and our patients had gallons of interferon. It wasn't gamma, they had alpha interferon. So the idea was wrong, but it led to do something, and so we found that patients with AIDS had huge amounts of alpha interferon in their circulation, which was quite stunning. And I should say that was never pursued until now, of course. But for years and years, instead of pursuing that, of course, people were given into it. It's crazy. So, but in retrospect, the appearance of interferon in the circulation of people with AIDS was, in fact, an indication of activation of innate immunity, which we know everybody now says, AIDS is a disease of involves activation of innate immunity. But in 1981, this appearance of interferon was an indication of that. And if you think about research that should have happened, that didn't happen, could have happened early, pursuing the significance of endogenous interferon in the circulation. You couldn't get any funding to do that. I tried. It was impossible, and this was a time when people were being given interferon rather than looking at how interferon might be actually part of the pathogenesis. And so it took 20, God knows how many years before. Now, of course, people are now looking at that, of course. So anyway, I'm sorry to.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Yes, another connection with Stuart is the CD3 and all of that. So
let's have our quick video from the World AIDS Museum, and then we'll come back and we're going to talk about what it's like for advancing science when it's also in the public realm and in the community and in the politics, which of course there are some similarities there with what we're seeing with COVID and the mixed messages and people getting almost irrationally attached to things outside of the scientific method. But we will be back in just a moment. If I can ask the doctors to turn off your videos, your cameras, and then we'll hear from the museum.
It's the first AIDS museum in the world.
It's a great place to come and learn about HIV/AIDS.
It's a celebration of life.
Okay, that was pretty quick. So Dr. Sonnabend, Dr. Schlossman, if you can turn your cameras back on.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay, great, welcome back. uh, we talked, I referenced this sort of fewer partners versus interrupting transmission of whatever it is. Um, Dr. Schlossman, as this became enmeshed in the politics, or I guess it even started in the politics, what was it like from your lab in Boston, seeing and hearing the bits and pieces about what was going on in New York and in the gay community and with Dr. Sonnabend?
Well, I give you just, I gave the first grand rounds at NYU on what was then GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency disease. And it was an evening session, and it filled up the auditorium to every physician around was there. And I talked about the immunology, the possibility that it might be an infectious disease. And there was a fair amount of anger in the audience. And not in the sense that it was telling them things they didn't want to know, of that this could be a sexually transmitted disease, that it could be a virus, that it could be infectious, that they had to take care. They wanted to attribute it to recreational drugs, a variety of things that seemed to be silly. And the questions after the lecture indicated to me that I may have convinced some people, but clearly not all. And that was a big surprise, because it seemed to me the most rational thing. And to find that a rather intelligent audience of sophisticated physicians and other people, that there was a significant number that were really resistant to even considering this idea, was a surprise. But I could hide. I was a professor at Harvard, and you're a baron up there. Nobody can bother you. And so you can say, okay, I had my difficulties with people in the gay community, and I had my difficulties with the Commissioner of Health in New York, who I suggested that they give out free needles for addicts who might transmit it. And he said he would not do it. And I called him stupid on television. And I was clearly not a very good politician. And I have to only say one aspect. About 15 years later, I get a call from Cambridge City that they want to consider the dispersal of free needles to addicts in the city, and they would like me to come to testify. And I said to the woman who called me, I've had enough experience with this. It's a mistake. I won't do it. She says, I know your experience. My father was Assistant Commissioner of Health, and he agreed with you against the commissioner. So, but there was a reluctance to do the right thing, whether it was free needles, whether it was the prophylaxis for gay men, safe sex, closing some of the bathhouses, which led to a fair amount of the promiscuity at that time, or whatever it was. There was a resistance to doing what seemed to be rational and the right thing. And that, unfortunately, probably affected a fair number of individuals who weren't warned early enough.
So, have you ever run into that kind of hostility or community response at any other time in your career?
Not really. I think those people who were treating leukemias for the first time, there was a resistance to that because they were not going to do enough good. But I had not experienced that in any of the diseases. We were the first to develop cleansed marrows for bone marrow transplantation and all of these things. We were the first to give monoclonal antibodies to treat leukemia and other diseases, which are more common now, which are now used all the time. But there was no resistance to it. People were saying that's a wonderful new way of treating people. It's a wonderful new way of thinking of an alternative approach. And and the kind of hostility I've never experienced.
And so what Joe and Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz and others who were sort of bravely and somewhat lonely at times advocating this message of using condoms and safer sex and really recognizing that these sexual behaviors were putting people at risk. It was at a time when the gay community, the gay liberation movement was in its infancy, and it had grown out of the 1960s, sort of a broader cultural change and sexual liberation for all. And in the 70s, it started to become a political reform movement. So by the early 1980s, you had our sort of first gay leaders in suits and ties wanting a place at the table, sort of the respectability, we're just like you, da 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 da. And then this epidemic hits, and some of them, the last thing they wanted to talk about is what many gay men were doing sexually, sort of the sexual fast track of gay men, of which I include myself amongst them. And so Joe was trying to navigate that with others. And Joe, tell us what that was like. I know that still is painful for you today.
Well, it was, I guess there were certain stages. In the beginning, I thought that I was being helpful. And so it became a shock and a surprise to find that my attempts to try and moderate or advise caution were being met with such hostility. I had to kind of absorb that. I mean, it was kind of a bit incomprehensible. I wasn't all that aware of the political or the issue involving gay men in the United States. I didn't know that. Michael Callan instructed me a bit about the history, but I went through a phase of feeling bewildered at the hostility, and so I fell over backwards to try and assure whoever I was writing to that there was no morals involved in this. It's just an issue of health, that I have no, and also to always, wherever possible, to assert the message that sex is incredibly important to the human experience. I mean, I was born in 1933, so I've certainly witnessed the awful pains that people have experienced because of sexual repression and all that, just awful. And that, people who've not been allowed to, whether gay, not gay, doesn't matter, who've had their life experience blighted because of all these emotional stuff involved. So I was aware of that, and so here we're dealing with life and death matters. So I was surprised at the hostility, and I don't think I ever it took me many years to sort of absorb it, as it were. So that feeling of surprise has never really left me, because this is, as Stu says, this is an appeal to reason, and if people resent that appeal, which actually is motivated by a desire to keep people alive, if they resent that and are willing, it's beyond my comprehension, even to this day, really. And so I don't think we're dealing with anything rational. That's what I've concluded. So I have to say that I've sort of come to understand probably that the experience of being homosexual in the United States must have been, well, maybe not today so much, but the time we're speaking, pretty horrible. The sort of repressive, homophobic environment that people grew up in, and then to actually be landed with this disease, is a challenge beyond anything that's even possible to put into words. And so, to some extent, maybe that's the way I try to understand it. It's not rational, that there've been such dreadful experiences. Just the mere fact of, people being rejected by their family, just awful. And so, I can't take it any further than that. It's just this, so I've got to say, I'm still bewildered at the hostility, which took grotesque forms, including, as you know, the destruction of my patient records. It's beyond understanding. I mean, to go to that length. And so, yeah, I'm still somewhat bewildered.
And so this then led into the really intense, sort of controversies and divisions around causation. So early on, Joe, you hypothesized that it could be something related to CMV. It could be something totally new. It could be multifactorial, which is the multifactorial model that you developed, that is sort of a, how, so let me start with Dr. Schlossman. What were your thoughts early on and what was causing this? You know,
Well, clearly, we weren't sure, but we did study young people with infectious mononucleosis who had abnormal activated T cells in their blood. We did look at lots of different patients, and it was clear that a virus could be causing this, but there were so many factors going on that we weren't sure, and you have to isolate the virus, and you have to be the virologist to do that. So there was no doubt in my mind that it could be a viral causation. The idea that the virus, HIV, would bind to CD4 and enter a cell was not high on my list of things, but certainly viruses could cause immunologic reaction, which could result in the loss of T cell populations. Why it would be chronic and so persistent and it was just unknown. But the reality was that science was focusing now. They had the tools to identify the patients, to follow their course, to see which cells were infected, and then they had the ability to grow viruses, and it was only a matter of time once the stage was set that this was a real disease that affected the immune response. That it was HIV, it could have been, but we knew of T cell leukemia viruses in animals. We knew of these things in the past, but did we know that they could specifically affect a cell in the human body? We did not know. But that's the way science is done. You start with a lot of possibilities, and it focuses and evolves, and you then understand it when you isolate the right agent.
and of course, one of the in terms of the community discussion, real problems around the idea of it being a single agent, whether a CMV or something else or something new that we hadn't yet discovered, versus multifactorial was important, because multifactorial was really speaking to gay men who were repeatedly getting different kinds of sexually transmitted infections. So that spoke more explicitly to behavior. And a single agent was, as I think the head of the gay doctors group one time wrote a piece in one of the gay papers saying it was just totally chance who got this and wasn't. And it wasn't really totally chance. You know, that was the Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz's "We Know Who We Are," their famous landmark article talking about their sexual histories and their histories with sexually transmitted infections that you know, created so much drama at the time. Joe, what were your thoughts? It's sort of going between CMV, new agent, multifactorial.
Okay, all right. So one of the things, yeah, well, I'll try and answer that one. At the time, we're speaking now 1981, the idea that diseases are multifactorial in nature was something that, as far as epidemiology is concerned, had taken hold already. For example, when it comes to heart attacks, nobody's surprised to say, well, it's not cholesterol, it's blood pressure. It's a combination of many different things acting together. And so then the notion of multifactoriality, if you like, was in general sort of taking a hold, it probably had taken in epidemiological circles. And the notion of single agent etiological issues, it's you know, it receded some. So I was a little bit surprised that one, you know, had so not just that. There's also a can't really try and organize all of this because there's quite a lot of issues involved in my trying to answer this. So I'm disposed, if you like, to believe in multifactorial explanations for almost everything, if you like. So and that there may be primary factors, but there's a multiplicity of things always. In general, I'm not speaking about this, about AIDS particularly. So you ask about where I stand in that. When the disease started, CMV was a likely culprit as having some degree of involvement for the reasons. Number one is that epidemiological studies had shown that gay men attending sexually transmitted disease clinics had an incredibly high prevalence of CMV antibody. So most people have CMV, you're an adult in an urban setting, but so with gay men though, the prevalence reached 90%, something. It was really kind of pretty enormous. Then in addition to that, the carriage of CMV in semen was quite high. This is from the 1970s already. So there was all of this. Then speaking about viruses affecting immunity, not just simply EBV, but CMV is another member of the herpes group, and that also has effects, immunological consequences. So it just seemed reasonable to think that CMV played a role. I think it still probably does. So as you know, people who are on suppressive treatment for HIV still have residual immune activation. It's not completely suppressed with the suppression of HIV. And CMV, and it's not just my idea, it's possible maybe one of the factors that continues to exert some degree of an effect and is responsible for partially, maybe completely, of residual activation. And as far as that goes, I should say there is an issue about condom use, and here's just a theoretical thing. I'll just digress very quickly about it. CMV is able to infect people multiple times. That's one of the properties it has. I was very aware of this from the transplant field. So people who receive organ transplants frequently get CMV. And one of the problems was, is the organ transplant activating a latent CMV in them, or is it producing a new CMV? And so the ability to detect different strains of CMV made it possible to answer that question. And it turns out that people who receive organ transplants, about 50% of them, I think, get a new CMV, but other 50% it's a reactivation of their own CMV. But from those studies that happened well before AIDS, one knew that CMV was able to infect people again and again and again. So that was a propensity that CMV has. So you're not immune. Having one strain of CMV doesn't stop you from acquiring another one. And CMV is present in high concentrations in semen. So there's always the thought that even today, the carriage of CMV in semen still may be a problem because the antivirals don't affect CMV. And that's a digression, so I'm not going to go there. So so there was a focus on CMV, not just me. There were epidemiologists who were looking at the epidemiology of CMV, the biology of CMV. So I'm not saying that CMV was the cause of it, but that it's possible that it played a role. It was a candidate, a reasonable candidate to look at as a factor in it.
But the reality, Joe, the patients hemophiliacs,
right,
were getting the disease, and that was with fresh frozen plasma.
Right. So
and drug addicts and people who got blood transfusions.
Yeah,
it was very clear that it was a straightforward infectious disease, and that would be relatively easy to pick up if the virologist went and looked.
Well, it seems
I didn't think of a multifactorial thing. It seemed to be.
In principle, I'm just saying I'm disposed to multifactorial explanation. It doesn't take away the fact that a single agent, may be a key thing, but not everybody who gets infected becomes diseased. So there is a distinction between infection and disease. And so getting infected is one thing, but then getting a disease from it is another thing. And so there are determinants, whatever they may be, of disease in people who are infected. So not every, so this like that is the attack rate. So it depends on, so even if HIV is a key thing, not everybody with there may be other factors that promote it, and which I think is probably true. And that would just be in general true, not specifically for HIV or AIDS, is that there are determinants of infection in people determinants of disease rather in people who are infected. So that you can get hepatitis B and you can die from it. Another person can get hepatitis B and they don't even know it, and all they know is that they're immune, they have antibodies. And they didn't even, so what's the difference? I mean, something is operating to make a difference. And it, it's probably multiple things.
But HIV really stood out as
no one's not taking away from that.
as a profound infectious disease.
Well, that's not what I'm not disputing that, that's not what I'm disputing.
Yeah.
And of course, that wasn't isolated until 84.
About that.
He was isolated in 83,
84. Yeah.
Okay, so we're at 5 o'clock, and I know you've both been generous and willing to stick around a little bit longer. But I wanted to have ask you each to comment on something about COVID. And we have a comment here from someone that I want to read. Where to go here? Okay, it was a private question, so I'm not going to say the person's name, but I want to read the comment and then ask you each to talk about how you see the response to COVID today in the early years of the epidemic. So this person writes, the parallels to the COVID crisis are noteworthy. I appreciate the work Dr. Sonnabend did to promote the idea of safer sex through limiting the sexual freedom that people like myself were enjoying in the mid to late 70s. By the time I read the New York Times article in 1981, I was certain, based on my coming out experiences, that I had GRID. There was some relief for me knowing that I probably had it, and I can understand how frustrating it was for people to restrict their passions in all aspects of human decision-making. Emotional needs always supersede logic, and we have an entire methodology for rationalizing our poor choices. Like the anti-maskers today, they see harm reduction as an affront to their free will. So sad. Joe, you were my doctor at the New York City Gay Men's Health Project in the late 70s, and you kept me afloat and alive back then. And I'm certainly wearing a mask these days for the privilege of continuing to live. Dr. Schlossman, tell us about your thoughts on COVID and the epidemic.
Well, I think it's unfortunately different. I think we should wear masks, wash our hands, and socially distance. But the reality is we're going to have a vaccine. And that is what we don't have for HIV today. And the chances are that vaccine will be here in the next 6 months and would resolve the problem. But for sure, you only have to look at large crowds that appear all over the country at different events where people are not socially distancing, not wearing masks, and clearly not washing their hands. And whatever it is, it's the same group that denies the rationale of COVID, that denied how to approach AIDS in the early 70s, early 80s.
I'm guessing there are a lot of people on this call who've been hearing for the last 35 years that an HIV vaccine is just around the corner. And there have been billions and billions spent. Why are you so confident? I know you're not the only one, but give us some encouragement. Why do you think it could happen in 6 months?
Well, because number one, I think they understand to a better extent that the antibodies neutralize the virus. And we've had a huge amount of experience with multiple viruses for immunization. And they have new techniques for generating virus, and they're using old techniques. And that they could show in a test tube that it produces a protective immunity. The antibody protects the infection of the cell. So it seems to me that that vaccine will come about. The HIV has not worked that way. And I'm not sure whether it's the change of the virus or the polymorphism and different strains. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's different.
It is very different. I mean, yeah, this is a different thing. Yeah. For one, HIV persists. I mean, it's always there, and it has a high mutation rate, of course. And,
yeah.
So Joe, what are your thoughts on the comparisons and contrasting this epidemic with the HIV epidemic?
Well, I think the politicization, for one, is a terrible thing. It happened with HIV, and it's happening with this, but I think that is just human nature at work. Sadly, one has to say that. And one other thought there is that within living memory, we've had one epidemic, that's the HIV epidemic, and we might actually say, what did we learn from that that could be of use to us in this? And I'm afraid we haven't learned anything, because we also, part of the reason is that we look back at the HIV epidemic, at least the establishment, whatever that means, looks back and considers their response as being exemplary and triumphant and all of this. And so you can learn nothing with an attitude like that sees no error. And so we're not, in a sense, able to learn from our previous experience. So we have this, it's a living memory. We have another epidemic, and unfortunately, or it's less likely that we're going to learn from, not from what was done well. We need to learn from the mistakes that we made, and we need to address them. So other differences, the effect of, or similarities rather, behavior. Behavior matters. And so for people who don't want to, who want to continue their behaviors, and they like to believe that if their behaviors are not damaging to their health, they live in some kind of emotional state and impervious to reason, and resent any attempt to modify behavior. In the case of COVID, it's wearing masks, just all that kind of stuff. In the case of HIV, safe. So people resent there are people, not people in general, but there are people who are so committed and so guarding of their, as they see it, their rights to behave just in any way they want to, that they are totally resistant to reason. So you can't, so that's similar. There are people, not everybody, obviously, maybe only a few, in the case of AIDS, who were defiant of safer sex recommendations, and nobody's going to interfere with my rights, etc., etc. And we have the same thing. So there are similarities that highlight, in both instances, behavior, the link of behavior with the acquisition of disease. And that has nothing to do with HIV being the cause. Again, you can focus, one of the things you can focus on HIV as the cause of AIDS, that's fine. But then you say, but you can't dismiss behavior, because although HIV may be the cause of AIDS, it's human behavior that spreads HIV. You just can't get away from it. So, so behavior matters. It really does matter. And for the sake of individual health and for the sake of the health of society, it does matter. And that's sad, that we can't sort of get that message. People who put their own individual rights ahead of any kind of social obligation. What can you do? I don't know. I think it's part of the fault, or fault's the bad word, the consequence of growing up, particularly in the United States, because me as a, I was already almost 40 years old before I set foot in the United States. So, I was brought up in a different culture, but the sort of emphasis on the person in the United States, on individual freedoms and freedom, liberty, and all that kind of stuff, of people being encouraged to express themselves, to realize their potential. They're not going to be losers, they're all going to be winners, etc., etc. It sort of makes it harder to express a social concern, because that's sort of just the opposite kind of thing. I'm just, as it were, speculating. I don't know that. I'm just speculating as a non-American. I just observed that the sort of emphasis on personal issues seems to be much more developed there than what I was brought up with. And so that may be part of, people feel they're entitled to personal things, and even at the cost of social health, or even at the cost of their own health, maybe they just refuse to recognize. Okay, that's about it. So.
Well, unfortunately, if we had to shut down the whole society, we would still have AIDS.
Yeah, I'm afraid. Yeah.
So we have a message here. Greetings and best regards to Dr. Sonnabend and to Dr. Schlossman from Felice. The researcher.
Hi, Felice. Good. Happy to hear from her. Yeah, good. Yeah, God. Yeah.
So I guess let's close. I want to pose a question to each of you. What from those early days of the epidemic, what do you think needs to be looked at and examined? What do we need to go back and understand? What's important for us to learn from then that you'd like to see more of a focus on by historians and academics and others looking at this?
Okay, well, okay.
I have difficulty, in retrospect, there were delays and challenges and resistance had to be overcome. But in reality, we've made HIV into a chronic disease which can be treated. And unfortunately, we don't have a vaccine to prevent it in everyone. But I think in retrospect that things were done reasonably well, and it took time to educate people. And I think that's true about all of the things we deal with.
Well, I'm less optimistic than you are, Stuart, about it. I don't think we did very well, because you can't, because something ends well, that doesn't forgive the years and years and years of suffering and the thousands, I was only too close to it. I witnessed just an awful degree of unnecessary suffering. So it's not mitigated by the fact that we have a protease inhibitor now. All that what ends well, all's well that ends well. That's just not true. You just cannot and should not forget the awful suffering that happened in the early 1980s, for years and years and years. So we shouldn't ever become complacent about that. And so
you have to educate people, and it's not the easiest thing.
No, it may be,
and people are resistant, and that's the nature of.
No, I can't. I don't want to believe that. It may be true, but I think that means you give. I don't. So what I would say about learning things is that maybe one of the things we could think about is how do societies respond to a health emergency? What's involved? What do we need to have in place to have a rational response to a health emergency? So that's something we can think about. We might have thought about it with the AIDS epidemic, and then we would have had something in place for the COVID, but we don't. So yeah, sit down.
I think they're entirely different epidemics.
And, maybe, but they aren't.
COVID, you want to close down the entire world?
No. I'm asking a general question. The general question is what do we need to have in place in order to respond to a health emergency, whether it's COVID or rabies or God knows, it doesn't matter what. So what structures do we need to have in place? So we could have learned that from admitting to failures in HIV, and we would have had something. So it's not immediately obvious what the answer to that is, but it's something to think about. How can we avoid the politicization and all that, what structures need to be in place? And we should, we honestly need to, that's what I think we could, that's one thing that could come out of it. And it might have come out of it with respect to AIDS, and we would have, had something that would prepare us for the next one and the next one and whatever. And so, yeah, so that's what I would say. I would like to be optimistic, otherwise, just throw up our hands and just say, well, this is the nature of things. And no, and I just don't think that all the suffering, if you like, that. So I just want to think, the early history of AIDS, and I was there as a doctor trying to help people without help from the authorities, basically completely without help, who failed to make the kinds of recommendations that might have helped. They just didn't do it, maybe out of ignorance or just who cares, I don't know why. And so people suffocated to death from pneumocystis. That's just not something that we should tolerate. Absolutely not. And you can't just sort of walk away from it because we've got a protease inhibitor. We don't want that ever to happen again.
But it hasn't. We've dealt with Ebola, we've dealt with lots of epidemics, and we've done very well.
We're not dealing with COVID, for example, we're not.
COVID is a pandemic which is totally different.
But they're all different. Ebola's different, we're all different, but nonetheless, there's certain things that are common. So I would like to be, I don't know, I can't say that we, because I try to keep people, it's just awful to see what we've all seen, and we can't just walk away from it and say it's in the nature of things for that to happen like that. No, I don't think so. We just shouldn't ever let things like that happen again. We need to try and, improve ourselves in some kind of way and try and learn from mistakes. Well, in order to learn from mistakes, we've got to admit to them in the first place. And if we persist in seeing our efforts with respect to HIV as a triumph, then we'll get nowhere. And so I don't agree that we did so well. I think because I was at the receiving end. I mean, by the receiving end, I mean, I had to take care of, do what I could for people. And here, there's Sean. When you came to, remember when you first, when you first came to see me, you've been kind of written off by your other doctors. And that's not good. I mean, and in those days, that somebody had anemia, oh, it's just AIDS. If they had diarrhea, it's just AIDS. Stuff like that. People just didn't, that's not right. And there always was, there is a course for these things, and maybe labor intensive, but you're either. I'm less sanguine than you, Stuart. I just don't like to accept things as being just as the way they are, and we've got to live with it.
It's not the way they are. I think there's been a lot done that in a positive way, and maybe they could have avoided some of the difficulties in the beginning, but that's not always the nature of it.
Sure. I mean, you've got a disease, for example, AIDS was a disease of compromised cell-mediated immunity. It wasn't the first time. So I was part of the infectious diseases community in New York. We used to have our intercity rounds. In fact, on Mondays, I used to go every 4, and that's where I first knew about AIDS. Actually, I didn't say that, but the case was presented in our intercity rounds that I used to enjoy those. And so in the infectious diseases community, infections of the immunocompromised host was a distinct subspecialty of infectious diseases. There were people who knew about that. They were people, infectious diseases colleagues, who knew about infections in the immunocompromised host. We knew what they were. We knew how to prevent many of them. We knew how to treat many of them, not cure them, obviously. And that expertise could have been brought to help people with AIDS in 1981. And that includes the prophylaxis for PCP, which was worked out by Walter Hughes in 1977. And it was certainly, so why wasn't that information translated into practice? So those are questions we should be asking. I think, Walter Hughes, who developed the prophylaxis for PCP in leukemic children somewhere in the South, he pumped in 1977. And before AIDS, with using trimethoprim sulfur, the same drug that we use now. So why was that information not made available to the doctors taking care of people? So those are the kinds of questions we might ask. We've got to admit, firstly, that the expertise was there, but wasn't employed by the powers that be. Why were people being given interfered on? And there were all sorts of questions we need to lots of things. But if we say everything worked okay and things, we're
not saying everything worked okay. We're saying this is the way things work normally.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Perhaps one of the differences with the epidemic is how politicized it was. And we'd never had anything like that, and with a targeted community that was, already under siege in different ways.
So you think this one is not politicized?
Pardon?
You think this COVID is not politicized?
No, it is. In that sense, I think there's a similarity. I'm talking about in terms of the epidemic. Well, I look back and I see, specific things. You mentioned, PCP prophylaxis, but there were things that had the gay community leadership responded differently, had the political leadership responded differently, had the public health.
Right.
We would not be here in 2020 with whatever it is, 80 million people having gotten HIV. It would have been some dramatically lower number. Same with COVID. Had we had different kind of leadership around this.
Yeah, but then fine. Why don't you pursue that thought? Okay. Yeah, if we had. So what are those things we should have had? We can say what they are, and we should then work to put them in place. That's me. I'm still at 87. I still have a spark of kind of, I don't know what. I wish for things to be better. Still.
Indignation. And so with that, I want to say thank you to both of you. There were many researchers and clinicians who were not interested at all in the epidemic. There was kind of an icky factor. It was gay men, it was anal intercourse, it was drugs, it was sex work, and there were many who just went the other way. And the fact that you didn't, and Dr. Schlossman, that you were so interested and supportive and cooperative when Joe contacted you, and Joe, your heroic efforts are the reason so many of us are still here. So thank you both very much. I want to say to you and to anybody on the call, if there are others you think that might be good interviews, good conversations, not just clinicians and researchers, but activists or survivors or people who provided care, people in policy positions that have a story to tell from those early days, send me a note or send a note to POZ if you want to turn this into a series and get some of these stories documented. So with that, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And to everybody on the call. Thank you to the crew at POZ, and thank you to the World AIDS Museum in Fort Lauderdale, which I have visited, and it is really, really well done. Not huge, but the collection I saw, it was professionally exhibited. It was fascinating. I learned a lot, and I think I know quite a bit about the early days of the epidemic. So I can recommend people visit it. So.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.